Oh, the one human strength, human exertion, human striving, where it occurs in quite a lot of places. I don't have my notes here with me, but later on I'll give you the reference if you like. Yeah, yes, that's what I'm referring to. This is quite a unique phenomenon. I don't know anywhere else in the world ever where significant numbers of people, and sometimes like 10 or 15,000 together, will convert to the Dhamma. And there are various reasons for this. Some of them are political, but primarily it's Indian culture, Indian society is moving ahead, and these people feel with some justification that they're left out of of things, and they feel once again with some justification that becoming Buddhist will free them from the stigma of being untouchable, and that's in traditional Indian society that's what it meant. That is, other Indian people of other castes wouldn't even touch them, and there was even a group of people called the unseeables who were not allowed to go into a village or a town in the daytime. If they ever went into the town, they were supposed to go at night. And there was this is going back 50 or 60 years, but it did happen that they had a sort of a wooden thing and they had to knock it to make a sound, so to warn people that they were coming. And in fact, in the Jatakas, there is actually a story where a high caste woman accidentally sees a untouchable, and it says she goes and washes her eyes out so that she's actually being polluted simply by seeing them. And this is not a good situation. And the reason these people move towards Buddhism is because the Buddha specifically, I mean, if they became Christian or they became Muslims, that would be okay too. But in the case of these people, the Buddha specifically addressed the problem of the caste system. So that gives them gives it a special attraction to those people. From time to time, during my numerous visits to India, I've stayed with these people, and one thing you notice about them is a real desire to know the Dhamma well. And I find it interesting that sometimes when you go to Buddhist countries, and quite a lot of Buddhists really don't care, they don't seem to take much notice. These people, now that they can read, they want to know what the Buddha had to say. And sometimes they're very fervent Buddhists, not always, but certainly I've met some like that. So it's interesting that 2,000 years later, just even the name of the Buddha, quite apart from his teachings, is enough to motivate people to make a major change in their lives. But anything else? I'll have to correct you there, or maybe you've read something that I haven't. I don't know anywhere where the Buddha is um, said to be omnipresent, etc. I don't know. That's usually the characteristics of a supreme being. In fact, I can tell you for certain there is no place in the Tipitaka where that is said. You seem to be somewhat confused there. Normally, people who believe in God, one God or another, usually say is all knowing, all powerful, and all benevolent, all loving. That's what you're referring to. I don't know anywhere where the Buddha is ever described as being like that. So, may I ask, where did you read that, or who told you that? From another speaker. That's what Richard has said, from another speaker. Next time you meet him, just get some clarification from him. Well, look, gee, I wish I was there at the time of the Buddha. Then I'd have woken up and saying, what was happening to you when you were sleeping? I had no idea what was going through the Buddha's mind when he was asleep. You know, in my life, as a monk, I've been asked many, many questions. I've never been asked that question. What was going through the Buddha's mind when he was asleep? I have no idea, but I'll take a guess. I suppose nothing. Did he dream? Well, we are told that at least before he was enlightened, he had some dreams. But whether he dreamed when he was enlightened, I really don't know. I can't imagine why he wouldn't. Next time somebody might be asking, when the Buddha was sleeping, did he snore? I don't know. Thank you for that question. That one has really made me think. Yes, there are. I can't give you one offhand, but it is frequently mentioned in the Anguttara Nikaya. If you have a copy of the new Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya, if you look up in the index at the back, it will tell you where you can find it. And I do remember there's one place where the Buddha is talking to a layperson about this meditation, and he says something very interesting. He says, you can do it even in your house full of children. But he specifically said that. Now, I imagine that he was talking about that children can sometimes be quite noisy, or that they demand, or they require a lot of attention. So he was telling this person, despite that, you might be able to find time to do this meditation, despite the fact that you've got a spouse and children and maybe grandchildren, that you can still do this meditation. As for the exact details, I don't really know where the Buddha goes really into it, but the ones that he talks about is reflecting on the Buddha, reflecting on the Dhamma, reflecting on the Sangha. Now, I know in Sri Lanka, a lot of people do this meditation, and when they do the reflections on the Buddha, they actually do some chanting. They chant to themselves. Iti piso bhagava araham samma sambuddho ninja charana sampanno sugato lokavidu anuttaro purisa dhamma sarati santa deva manusaram buddho bhagavati. They just repeat this several times. I know some people do it that way. Myself, I do it the way that I mentioned to you. I imagine what it would have been like when the Buddha did this particular, or when he met that person, etc. Now, you can do that if you know something about the suttas and the stories in the Buddha's life. So doing it that way requires that you know something about the Buddha's life. And there are plenty of books describing incidents in the Buddha's life. Right, thank you for that. That's what you call the Mahapurusha Laksana, the 32 signs of a Mahapurusha, an exceptional being, an exceptional human. So there are several places in the Tipitaka where this is mentioned, and scholars have given it quite a lot of attention. In fact, one scholar has written a very interesting book on the subject. Ah, yes, here it is. This is a book where a scholar has gone through all the texts that mention this and look at other information about this idea. And the reality is nobody knows where this idea came from. But in the suttas, it's always mentioned as a Brahman science. The science of looking at the body of a human being and saying, oh, if he's got this mark, that means he's auspicious, or if his feet are like this, he's like that. I think even in Chinese culture, you get this idea that if you have a mole or something, that this is a good sign or that's a bad sign or something. So apparently, at the time of the Buddha, there was this pseudoscience of predicting things about people according to various marks or signs on their body. And so it seems that the Buddhists adopted this idea in order so that when Brahmins would say, well, who was your teacher? He could speak well on that, but he didn't have any of those special signs that shows that you're exceptional. And so at a later time, I would say probably within the second or the third generation of Buddhists, they started claiming, yeah, well, our teacher did have such auspicious signs. And this was incorporated into the suttas. Now, as you said, your question, some of these signs are very, very strange. I mean, like you said, the arms are supposed to come down to his knees. The one you didn't mention is his tongue is so long he can lick his forehead. Oh, goodness me. Well, all I can say is that when he was born, if his father and mother looked at him and they said, oh my God, what have we got? So that's one thing. And this is the second thing is this, that there are numerous places in the Tipitaka where it describes the Buddha meeting people, but none of them ever say, goodness, look at this guy. Did you see that? His tongue is so long he can lick the front of his face, and he's got these great big arms going, and he's got webbed feet like a frog. Nobody mentions that. So, for example, if we look in the second sutta in the Tipitaka, the Samanyapala Sutta, King Ajatasattu goes with Ajita, the court physician. The two of them go together to meet the Buddha. It's in the evening time. And when they come to where the Buddha is, he's surrounded by his disciples. And King Ajatasattu looks at the crowd and he asks Jivaka, which one is the Buddha? Now, if the Buddha had all those crazy signs, the king would have been able to pick him out immediately because these signs are so strange. Here's another one. When after the Buddha was enlightened, it says he took the road from Uruvela to Gaya on his way to Varanasi to meet his 5 former disciples. And it says in the suttas, as he was going along, he met a wandering ascetic called Upaka. And it says that Upaka, from a distance, Upaka could see the Buddha and could see that there was something special about him, that his face was very radiant, that he walked with pose and grace, so that when he got up to the Buddha, he said to him, "Who is your teacher?" And the Buddha said, "I have no teacher." Then they had a brief discussion. Now, it clearly says in the suttas that Upaka was impressed by the Buddha's calm and serene face. Doesn't mention anything about these signs. So there are numerous places where the Buddha has encounters with people, and in none of them do they mention these signs. Now, as you said, who asked the question again? What was his name?
Jeheshko.
Kako. As you very correctly said, these are so strange. You would think that these people would notice it, but they didn't. And the reason why they didn't was that the Buddha didn't have these signs. This idea was put into the suttas later, probably because Brahmins were resisting, or they were unimpressed by the Buddha because, well, according to our law, our ancient sciences, to be enlightened, you've got to have all these strange physical features. And so the early Buddha said, yeah, well, our teacher had them too. And I think that's how these signs came into the, to be inserted into the suttas. So we simply can't take this seriously. The Buddha, as we were saying, was physically not much different from you and I. Did any of the Buddha's disciples have an experience, a vision of the Buddha after he passed away? That's an interesting question. And the reason why I think it is interesting, because there was a very great Thai master, at least people believed he was a great Thai master. I can't remember, Achan Man, was it? And he wrote an account of his life. And in that book, he said the Buddha used to come to him each night and talk to him. I find that very strange. It must be a delusion, or it must have been his imagination. The Buddha is not accessible. He has attained enlightenment, and I know nowhere, I don't know any, certainly nowhere in the Tipitaka or even in the commentaries does it mention that the Buddha can come to people. You can't have a vision of the actual Buddha. So when I read that, and I was told that this monk was a really great monk and a great meditation master, I must say I had to have my doubts. And it's clear that he's not saying that he imagined the Buddha came to him. He says the Buddha did come to him. Very strange. It's not much to elaborate there. This is the 9 virtues of the Buddha is a sort of a devotional practice, and so it is to highlight how exceptional that the Buddha was, as indeed he was, and so they just say that he can't be compared with anybody else in terms of his wisdom, his compassion, the depth of his understanding. So I think that's all that it means, that there was nobody else at that time, and I happen to think not even now, who was comparable in his, not just his realizations, but his ability to communicate that wisdom to us, that he had no comparison. Oh, here we have Lu Chun again. I asked the question, it's disappeared. Read it for me.
No, it's not raise a question. I have been thinking out loud for many times about, we know what the Buddha did when he was awake, and therefore he can inspire us. We could also use his awake, all the teachings about what he does when he's awake, what he taught, that we could follow. But I was wondering, there was a gap between the time when he's awake and he's asleep. At that point of gap, what happens? And I have myself not sure. Now, why I asked this question was because I do have some nights when I sleep, when some thoughts about the Buddha's teachings and and some of the ideas that came out during the sleep about the Dhamma and all those things. And I was wondering, during the Buddha's time, what really happened, and is this something I should be experiencing or not? That was the reason why I asked this question, right? So that I want to understand, during the time of the Buddha, what was his state, and if he's what that state, is that something that we should also aspire to practice in our sleep, as opposed to during the day we are mindful we can do? In other words, should we sleep mindfully, or should we just sleep and doesn't know what to do?
Right. So I don't think what you've said, I can't say I've ever had that. Occasionally I dream, but I can't ever remember dreaming about the Buddha, but apparently you do, and you can. It seems to me to be okay. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that. And I would just reiterate the other thing. I know of nowhere in the Tipitaka or in the commentaries where it mentions people dreaming about the Buddha, or that they should dream about the Buddha. So, but however, you seem to have a unique experience of that. So I'd say don't try to stop doing it. If it seems to be helpful to you, and maybe you find that it energizes you or inspires you, then let it happen. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah. No, this story is not in the Tipitaka. It's one of the many legends that grew up after the Buddha. So it seems the Buddha had some psychic powers. His ability to maybe not read people's minds, but to sense what they might be thinking. Probably because he was very observant and very sensitive. So we are told that he was able to read minds. We are told that he was able to sometimes hear conversations over a long distance. This could be some sort of psychic ability. But the so-called twin miracles, this is very exaggerated, very sort of fantastic miracle. And significantly, it's not mentioned in the Tipitaka. So it's just a later legend. It's quite understandable that in later times, particularly Indians, and Indians have got very vivid imaginations. They like things very colorful and baroque. So it's quite logical that they would believe that the Buddha had these really extraordinary powers. But there's very little like that in the Tipitaka itself. This is one of the reasons why I think becoming familiar with the suttas is good, because then you know what is the authentic and early records and what are the records that took place hundreds or sometimes many hundreds of years later. I think the most extraordinary miracle attributed to the Buddha was that he went up to heaven. And he spent 3 months up there teaching his mother the Abhidhamma. Well, let me finish my story. And now I studied the Abhidhamma when I was at university, and I always found it incredibly dull. It didn't inspire me very much at all. As it so happens, I had an extremely good Abhidhamma teacher, Professor Y. Karunadasa. He was able to make it very lively in that. But I must say, sometimes I joke when the football is on the television, or I have trouble sleeping at night. I pick up the Abhidhamma and read it, and I fall asleep immediately. It's pretty dull. So when I hear that the Buddha's mother, she had to listen to this for 3 months, oh, it must have been awful. But the key of the story is, so we are told, that after the 3 months, the Buddha came down from heaven on a sort of cosmic, what would you call it, escalator. And there were actually 3 of them. One on one side was made of crystal, and the other one was made of lapis lazuli or something. And the Buddha came down on the central one. And on the one on the left, Indra was holding an umbrella over the Buddha. And on the other side, Brahma had a fly whisk. Now that's a miracle. Can you imagine an escalator going from the clouds all the way down? Oh, mate, that really is a miracle. But then we have a curious situation. According to the story, when after the Buddha died, the senior monks met together to collect all the teachings of the Buddha so that they could be preserved. And Ananda, he remembered all of them, but he completely forgot about this miracle because it's not in the Tipitaka. Now, if it really happened, boy, you'd remember that for the rest of your life. In fact, I mean, thousands of people must have seen it. We're talking about a ladder or a stairway in heaven. So clearly, this is not just a much later story, but it's a rather very exaggerated story. And it's interesting, this is interesting too. According to the story, the Buddha taught the Abhidhamma to his mother for 3 months. Now, if that is so, you would expect this, if it really happened, you would expect that to be mentioned in the Abhidhamma Pitaka, but it isn't. It's not in the suttas, it's not in the Vinaya, it's not even in the very place where you'd expect it to be, in the Abhidhamma. So we can say with a very high degree of confidence that this is a much later legend. Okay, that's an interesting question. And I think the answer would be no. You see, perhaps we can give a special talk on this subject. Understanding what Nibbana or Nirvana is not easy. So people have asked me, when you attain Nirvana, do you still exist? So when somebody asks me that, I always say, well, do you exist now? And they say, yes. And I said, so what do you mean that you exist? Most people have never really thought about it, but they say, well, I have a body and I can think, I can talk, I sense what's going on around me. I have an orientation in space. And I say, yeah, I agree with you. All that is the characteristics of existence. And when you attain Nirvana, you don't exist in that sense. You don't have a body. You don't go to the toilet. You don't eat, etc. So then people say, well, what is it? Well, that's not an easy question to answer. And it would take probably a whole 1 hour talk to get at least some idea of it. So we'll leave that for some other time. Well, scholars generally agree in saying that the Buddha probably didn't speak Pali. And there are fairly good reasons for that. But I note that Professor Richard Gombrich, who is an outstanding scholar of Buddhism, he recently wrote a book. It's here somewhere. He sent me a copy. Where he, I can't find it right now, but he has, after many years of studying Buddhism, he's come to the conclusion that the Buddha probably did speak Pali. Professor Gombrich knows what he's talking about. His knowledge of Buddhism is exceptional. So I think his opinion needs to be taken into account. But it's also true to say that the majority of scholars think that the Buddha did not speak Pali. So exactly where Pali was spoken and what sort of a language it was, there are different opinions about that. But I think we can generally say that if the Buddha did not speak Pali, he spoke a language quite close to it. So when we look at the other languages of the time, Adrimagadi, which the Jain canon is written in, is quite similar to Pali. And of course, Sanskrit is recognizably similar to Pali also. But of course, it really doesn't matter what language the Buddha spoke. What he said and what he meant is clear enough from what is transmitted through Pali. So don't forget, as we said before, there was no writing at the time of the Buddha, so we don't have any examples of the different languages that did exist in North India at that time. The earliest written language we have are the edicts of King Asoka. And scholars point out that King Asoka put his edicts all around India, many different places. And they were written in the dialect or the language spoken at that particular place. If there was a particular language in this area, then his edict was in that language. And if there was another language or a dialect in that area, so scholars point out that the edicts of King Asoka from the west part of India seem to be closer to Pali. So there is one theory that Pali was a language from the western part of India. Scholars have got different opinions on the matter. Anything else?
Okay. I think I'll just directly address the question from JC. I think the Bhante just mentioned that the Buddha taught his founder Dhamma in heaven. Then I think that Bhante mentioned that was not mentioned in any sutta. It was added much later on. So yeah, it's not.
No, it wasn't added later on. It's not in the Tipitaka at all. It was never added. It's found in the commentaries. Yeah, well, if you have a copy of my book, Footprints in the Dust, I give quite a detailed, I give full details of this incident. And for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, scholars and others have been fascinated with this question ever since Buddhism became known in the West. There are literally dozens of articles written on this subject. And it's very strange. Some time ago, I wrote an article, Vesak, published in a newspaper, and I said, this article is going to be completely different from the others. Everybody wants to know about the Buddha's last meal. I'm going to write an article about the Buddha's first meal. That is, the first thing he ate after he was enlightened, which I find much more interesting. However, this is the situation. So the last thing that the Buddha ate was something called Sukara Madhava. And scholars have gone over this for at least 100 years. We simply don't know what it was. And not only that, when we look in the commentaries, they don't know what it was either. Dhammapala, who wrote the commentary on this, said, well, some people say it's this, some people say it's that. According to other people, it's this. So that means in the 5th century AD, they didn't know what it was either. The word itself, sukara, means a boar, that is a male pig. And madhava means soft. So it could mean tender pork. It could mean that, but not necessarily. For example, I went to a restaurant in Singapore quite some time ago. Somebody very kindly invited me for a meal, and I picked up the menu, and one of the dishes on the menu was Buddha jumps over the wall. Well, what's in that dish? Is there a wall in the dish and there's a Buddha jumping over the wall? So the name of the dish, I mean, we've got funny names for some English dishes. Spotted dick is is quite a common and popular meal, but it doesn't mean that when you get that, it's got a spotted dick in it. So the word itself could mean tender pork, but it might mean something that doesn't mean that the dish was tender pork. We simply don't know what it was. Okay. Anyway, as you in your question, you said after the Buddha ate this meal, he became very ill. In fact, he had diarrhea with blood in it, and that sounds very serious. But this is what I have said in my book, and I think that this is quite reasonable. it specifically says that the day before, the Buddha stopped at the side of the river and asked Ananda to get some water for him. Now, I think it is quite possible that the water was contaminated and that he had gastroenteritis, which you get from from drinking dirty water, infected water. Now, the thing about gastroenteritis is it takes at least a day, sometimes 2 days, for the symptoms to come. So you will have had this experience. You eat something and you become sick, and you naturally think that what you just ate was the problem. But actually, it was probably something you ate a day ago or 2 days ago that's really causing your stomach problem, because it takes some time for the infection to take hold. So just because the Buddha became sick shortly after eating Sukara Madhava does not mean that that's what made him sick. We also know from the Mahaparinirvana Sutta that at least a month ago he was very ill then too. So I suspect that this is what happened. A month or two before he got to Kusinara, he had become very sick and he became very weak. He was 80 years old. So he was probably tired and weak again. And then a day or two before, he drank some water and it gave him gastroenteritis. And the symptoms came shortly after he ate his final meal. And that he died not as a result of eating Sukara Madhava, but simply because his time was up. He was old, he was weak, he was sick, and he was tired. I think that's the reason why he passed away. That's what I think about the matter. How many of the Jatakas are true? None of them. No. They're stories, wonderful stories, very illuminating stories. None of them are true. The Jatakas are a very misunderstood book. Now, let me explain. Every Jataka has got 4 parts. The story of the present, the Jataka story, the verses or the gathas in the story, and the summary. Okay? Every Jataka. And what are these parts? Well, the first part is the story of the present. So one day the Buddha was going along and he saw 2 monks fighting, and one monk punched the other monk. And then Ananda went to the Buddha and said, those 2 monks had a fight and one monk punched the other monk. And then the Buddha said, well, Ananda, that's not the first time he punched somebody. And then he proceeds to tell a story. Once when Brahmadatta was king of Benares, and then he tells the story. And that's the Jataka story. First part is the thing that prompted the Buddha to tell this story. Okay? And then you have the Jataka story. Then at the end, and then within that story, there will be at least one verse called gathas. And in the first part of the Jataka, in the first chapter or the first book of the Jataka, all the stories have one verse in them. In the second part of the Jataka, all the stories have 2 verses in them. In the third part, each have 3 verses in them, all the way up to many. So that's the third part of the Jataka. And then at the end of the Jataka story, you have the summary. And in the summary, it says, the elephant was the Buddha, the elephant driver was Ananda, and the nasty man was Devadatta. In other words, it tells you who the characters in the Jataka story were, supposedly. So that's the Jataka story. Okay? So story of the present, Jataka story, verses, and summary. Clear? Now, only the verses are canonical, meaning that only they were spoken by the Buddha, not the story, only the verses. Okay. Now you've asked the question, are the Jatakas true? Well, clearly not. So there's one Jataka story where it says that the Bodhisattva was an elephant and he was talking to a man, and the man, when have you heard elephants talking to people? Obviously enough, monkeys don't talk, etc. So what are these Jatakas? Well, India is the home of great stories. There are many collections of wonderful stories in the Indian tradition. For example, there's the Panchatantra, which is very similar to the Jatakas. And in fact, some of the stories in the Panchatantra are also found in the Jatakas. And then there's another collection of stories, fables, called the Hitopadesa. Same. Some of the stories in the Hitopadesa are found in the Jatakas. So what happened is, at a later period, maybe 200 or 300 years after the Buddha, some very clever, very skillful monks collected all these stories. Nobody owned them. We have no idea who wrote them. They've just been stories in circulation for ages. And people love these stories. So they collected all these stories together, and to give them a Buddhist flavor, they said, the hero of each of these stories was the Buddha in one of his past lives. So that's what the Jatakas are. They are a large collection of fables and stories collected from all over the place and given a Buddhist feel by saying that the hero in each story was the Buddha in one of his past lives. And for many centuries, probably for at least 1,000 years, for the average Buddhist, their Buddhism was not the suttas or the Abhidhamma. Their knowledge of Buddhism was the Buddha Charita, the life of the Buddha, and Jataka stories. Now, I've heard people say that Jataka stories are good for children. Yeah, they are. But they're good for adults too. And in fact, there's quite a lot of stories there that are quite rich. You wouldn't want to tell them to children. Some of them are very violent. Some of them have got a distinctly sexual aspect to them. They're great stories. So it is to the genius and the cleverness of Buddhist monks that they could see that one way that we can transmit the Dhamma and Buddhist values to people is through these really entertaining stories. But there is no suggestion that these are true, that they actually happened. They are fables. Elephants don't talk. I know people think that their dog talks to them, but they don't really. Give us one more question before we finish. Yeah, this is this is a bit of a problem. This looks like something that's been added to the sutta also. So this is, the story is that supposedly the Buddha could live for an eon. That's an awful long time. I thought human life was dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Anyway, that's what it says. And so the Buddha hinted, if you ask me, I'll live forever. But Ananda didn't get it, didn't understand. He didn't take the hint. And so finally the Buddha said, okay, that's it. You didn't ask me to live forever, so I'm not going to. And then Ananda said, oh, really? Oh, no, Tathagata, live for it. No, it's too late now. You had your chance. And then he did, this is a really silly story. I don't know where this story came from, but it's hard to take it seriously. Okay? Being physically an ordinary human being, in fact, it's probably remarkable that the Buddha got to 80 years. Probably the majority of the life expectancy of the average Indian was probably quite low in those days. Probably 50 or 60 years, and you'd have been very lucky. So if the Buddha died at 80, and that's what we're told, it's mentioned in the Tipitaka, then he was probably very, very old. The second thing that you've got to remember is that since he was 29, he led a very hard life. He spent most of his life wandering in India. Summertime in India is incredibly hot. Eating food that he begged. So probably occasionally he got a really good meal. At other times he may have got simply scraps. He didn't have an umbrella. I don't know anywhere in the Tipitaka where it says that he wore sandals. So spending his life wandering around India in the heat and in the rain, eating scraps, this must have had some impact upon his physical capacity. So I think that by the time he was 80, he was probably worn out. And it's remarkable that he lived to such a ripe old age. But anyway, to return to your question and the story, the Buddha couldn't have lived for an eon. His body, after even 80 years, his body was probably just about ready to finish. And it had nothing to do with Ananda not taking the hint about living forever. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your questions. I hope some of the things I said about the Buddha as a human being, and particularly about the meditation Buddhanusati, was something that you found useful and that it'll have some impact upon you. Also, thank you for your questions. All of them were good questions. There one about dreaming. I'm going to give some thought to that. In fact, I might end up dreaming about it tonight. And also, thank you, Brother Ang, and everybody else who helped to organize it tonight. And I look forward to sharing my understanding of the Dhamma
next time we meet.